Good morning. I'm Arya from the third year BLLB program, joined by
Hiranya, fourth year BL.
the Socio-Legal Review publishes interdisciplinary research at the intersection of law and the social sciences. Apart from our publication-focused work through our interviews, we aim to contribute to a public-facing dialogue with wider audiences and familiarize them with socio-legal scholarship. We are delighted to be in conversation with Professor Ankita Pandey to interview her about her new book, Becoming Allies, Civil Liberties Activism in India. Professor Pandey is a political scientist, currently a professor at the Jindal School of International Affairs at OP Jindal Global University. Her research focuses on citizenship in practice, civil society activism, social movements, and legal mobilization in contemporary India. In addition to her core training in political science, she draws from the disciplines of history and anthropology to explore the deepening of democracy in India since the 1960s. She received her PhD from the University of Oxford, where she was a Commonwealth Scholar. In Becoming Allies, she explores a vital but often overlooked dimension of social movements, the role of those who support a cause without being directly affected by its injustices. Drawing on interviews conducted with civil liberties activists and on documents from their private records, this book traces the evolving politics of allyship in India. Anchored in the histories of groups like the People's Union for Civil Liberties and the People's Union for Democratic Rights that arose in the context of the Naxalite movement and the emergency, the book sheds light on the ethics, dilemmas, and struggles of standing alongside others in a struggle. To begin, Professor, could you tell us a bit about how you came about working on this theme for your PhD and how it eventually developed into a book?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. How did I begin? I was looking at civil liberties. I assumed that they were yet another social movement. And when I began, I was writing the history of overlooked social movement in the country. So I thought that this movement had sort of been there for long enough, and there weren't many, sort of commentaries on it, especially nothing that was based ethnographically on interviews based on interviews with the activists. So when I started, I thought I was writing the history of a social movement, and then over time I realized that the puzzle lay elsewhere. That I kind of realized that this category itself was not applying. It made me uneasy to use that category. So I ended up rethinking what they were a case of, and yeah, so and eventually I ended up actually finding a conceptual vocabulary to understand this politics.
No, thank you for that, Professor. That is insightful. I think another question, I think one of the foremost questions that we had while reading the book, I think the introduction opens with how Ambedkar refused to endorse a civil liberties approach in the sense that he seemed to say that it was focused too much on state instead of society. The critique was not directed at caste. So this distinction between civil liberties and democratic rights, is this something, is this critique something that still stands today? Because over the time, like in the ever since independence, we have seen the idea of constitutional rights evolve and expand, especially with the intervention of judiciary. So does civil liberty necessarily have to be a state facing project, or can it take more positions on social hierarchy without losing its core definition?
Mm. Um, Wonderful question. Thank you. Ambedkar's critique is that this is a form of politics that is overly focused on the state at the expense of looking at the injustices that are present in society. He writes this in 1937 to, there's a civil liberties in India conference that is going to take place in London. And he sent the memorandum that will go from an organization, one of the first sort of civil liberties organizations in colonial India. They called ICLU, the Indian Civil Liberties Union. So the Indian Civil Liberties Union had sent a memorandum to Ambedkar and had solicited his signature. And what you said is his critique. So he writes back saying, I'm sorry, I will not be able to sign this because I don't stand for a form of politics that is focused on the state at the expense of looking at societal injustices. So Your question was, does that critique stand? Yes, I think the critique stands. And I start with it in the book because of the importance of this critique. At the same time, the activists I interviewed are aware of this critique. They are very they are greatly aware of the fact that injustices that are often along the lines of caste and gender get overlooked if you are focused on extrajudicial sort of violations. Um, and in the 1980s, I think some of my activists would talk about in the 1980s, there is a period of intense landlord and labor conflict in Bihar. And it's very difficult to understand that conflict or to even make sense of that conflict without understanding caste, because caste plays such an important role in that conflict. So over time, even working on civil liberties issues, they have become more and more aware of questions of societal injustices. They have raised issues around manual scavenging. In the Hathras case, they did a fact finding on sort of sexual violence on Dalit women. So I'd like to say that there is some awareness. And there is an attempt also among the activist community to address this critique. But I do think the critique still stands. And I also think that it's not a critique that can get resolved, one way or the other. It will remain as a productive sort of attention. It's something that anybody, any activist doing this politics should remain mindful of. So Ambedkar is providing some sort of a corrective to think about it. And the other thing is that, when you start practicing any politics, it's very difficult to remain state focused or society focused, because of the overlaps of sort of, state and society. There will be, in practice, it's very difficult to remain overlooking one dimension and focus on the other. The other bit that you asked about, whether civil liberties is state facing by definition, that it is. I do think that historically there are groups like the American Civil Liberties Union, the National Council of Civil Liberties in the UK, even the ICLU, the group that I just mentioned. All of them have focused on state actors abusing their power. So they have focused on preventive detention, they have focused on custodial torture, what otherwise are known as human rights issues in the rest of the world. They have focused on, so the dynamic has been citizen state dynamic. Even theoretically, civil liberties tradition is about protection of citizens from the abuse of power by the state. So even in that theoretical manner, this is true. But as I said, in practice, society and state cannot be neatly separated. So think of communal violence. Now there will be an element of civilian violence, but there will always also be an element of administrative incapacity or even, overlooking things. Or there will always be a sort of a dynamic in a conflict where both kind of play a role. So civil liberties is state facing, but actually more broadly, I want to say all social movements are state facing, whether they want a law to be repealed or whether they want a law to be implemented. Think of most of the social movements in India's history. Think of the women's movement asking for rape laws to be, amended. Think of the farmers' movement wanting, 3 laws to be held. There is always, even so, not just civil liberties, even in democratic rights or rights in general, there is an aspect of looking towards the states that is inevitably present within it. So yes, I would say that it is quite necessarily largely a state-facing project.
Right. Thank you, Professor, for that response. I think that also makes me and us wonder, since we are talking to some extent critiques about civil libertism. One thing again we noticed, one of the themes was this idea of paternalism as a danger inherent to the idea of ally activism. So, like for instance, the episode recounted later in the later parts of the book about Nagbhushan Patnaik, where he was sentenced to death, but he wanted to he wanted to prevent any sort of interaction with the state and hence not try to fight that sort of death sentence. Regardless, civil liberty groups continued to provide him with legal aid, etc. So ultimately, is the question that ally activism ultimately a politics of amplification? Are these organizations amplifying a struggle? Are they speaking on behalf of it? And so, is paternalism very inherent to the ally of activism? And I ask this question in context of the fact that, especially in the times we live in, with access to media and law, with access to media, etc., uh, is the danger has the danger increased over the years with this added leverage?
Mm. Oh, again, very good question. Thank you so much for it. Um, Let me start by describing the politics of amplification a little bit, and then I'll come to this business of paternalism and representation, things like that. And the politics of amplification is when you are, as a collective, at least in the way that I study it, I'm not looking at individual cases. As a collective, as a group, you are picking up a cause that you are not the direct victim of. And should that be successful, you are materially directly not going to benefit also. You may have other benefits. It's very fulfilling to live one's politics. There is a great sense of purpose in it. So I'm not saying that that this is some altruistic, selfless form of politics. That's not what I'm saying. But there is an element of the people who are doing the politics are one step removed from those who have a direct stake. And what they're doing is they're helping claims travel from one domain to the other. So say there is a remote village where police firing has happened on protesters. From there, taking it to the sort of local news, to national news, to bringing it to the parliament, to taking it to the judiciary, taking it to national press or media, sometimes international human rights organizations. So I'm seeing politics of amplification as something that allows claims to travel across different domains, claims that otherwise could have just remained local claims. Now, when I describe it like that, I hope you can see that it's not a neutral activity. Obviously, they're not just amplifying every claim. They're not some sort of mediators playing that function of. So they're not amplifying every claim. They are selecting, and when they are selecting, it is on the basis of the worldview they have, the kind of politics that they inhabit or believe in. So Nagbhushan Patnaik case is a case like that, where there has been, and it's an interesting case because we see an instance of allyship here, even when the victim is actually not requesting for it. In most cases, they get approached by small groups saying, "Can we do a fact finding? Can this be amplified in Delhi and in national press?" But for anyone who doesn't know, Nagbhushan Patnaik was one of the founding leaders of the CPI-ML from Odisha. And he got arrested in 1969 in what is called the Parvatipuram conspiracy case. And the Sessions Court in 1970 had sentenced him to life, sentenced him to death. Now, what Nagbhushan Patnaik did is he refused to seek any mercy. He refused to request for the constitutional remedies that would be available to somebody who has been sentenced to death. And in fact, he had asked for an early execution. Now, civil liberties groups, so in particular at that time, there was, KG Kannabiran, there was Malti Chaudhary, Jayaprakash Narayan himself, there was Harikrishna Mahtab, etc. They all shared this collective idea that what has happened is unfair. This should not be the case. So here, allies have their own sense of what the state owes somebody, and they may not share it with the so-called victim, but they share it internally with themselves. So allies have a sense of what a constitutional democracy ought to do, how it ought to behave, and so they continue to actually fight for a long time for his bail, to organize legal aid, to financial help for the family, to ultimately, I think in 1980s or 81, he was released, though he was quite unwell by that time. But he was in fact released and was not executed as the Sessions Court had said. Now, of course, you're right. Paternalism is a real danger here. It's kind of inherent, right? Like, if I am going to use my privilege and my credibility and my social position to do something, to do some kind of politics, there's always a chance that all of that will also work, could also, it could have its dangers. It could lead to what you said was paternalism. It could be that instead of the spotlight going to the cause, the spotlight is on the person itself. But what I want to say is that in a lot of the studies of social movement, we don't even think of allies as independent actors. They often get classified, as I've said in the book, along with the movement itself. So it's only when we actually recognize it as an independent form of politics, there's something happening here, then we can open up the possibility of scrutinizing it, talking about its dangers, both like the larger civil society keeping allies accountable, as well as those who they are claiming to, those whose causes they are amplifying, also keeping them accountable. But when I see my contribution as opening up that domain for scrutiny, so that these issues of paternalism, etc., can actually be spoken about.
Right. Professor, on this note as well about how civil liberties groups see themselves, a couple of instances in the book, such as this discussion about Assam movement, where one set of people, one set of groups were more in favor of supporting the idea of self-sovereignty and determination, while another set of people in Assam, along with other civil groups, were more interested in the rights of refugees. So these ideas of competing claims, competing rights, this has been what do these cases reveal about the limits of allyship? Because as it seems, in such instances, there's no obvious victim and no obvious oppressor. There's clearly a difference in how things are being seen. So would you say that a narrower mandate of the idea of civil libertism, again, say centered on state violence, would make these groups more efficient? Or how would solidarity look like when things like these come up?
So in the book, the Assam movement is one of the issues that the People's Union for Democratic Rights debates quite intensively, and many of them reported to me as one of the difficult moments of when you have both groups with some legitimate grievances. How do you begin taking a position as a civil liberties platform? One of the things that I should say a little bit, like putting this in context of why I've spoken about it in the book, was to actually show, when I met activists, many of them rehearsed with considerable, giving it considerable time and intensity, the debates they had had. They remembered the debates they had had. They rehearsed it for me within the organization, with fraternal organization. They looked back, they thought back to whether the positions that they had taken back then were kept them in good stead or not. So the point I was trying to make in the book vis-a-vis the Assam example is that debating on some of these difficult issues is what actually creates their own identity. So I'm saying that allyship, when by definition, if you're going to choose which causes to support or where as a small organization where to focus one's resources and attention, it will not be predetermined. So it will need to be debated in each case by case, and collectively what allyship means to them will only come to fore through these debates. So there's a way in which there's a way in which those who are directly affected don't need to debate. They are in a position already. They find themselves in a position already. But it's only people who are one step removed who have to actually debate and figure out where they want to be. So I've talked about how debating is a way in which this collective identity actually develops. Now, as far as so in this particular case, what it did was it actually made allyship more modest. They learned that it's morally not uncomplicated to be an ally. You'll have to. It's difficult business, and they held back because they were unsure about which way to go. So I would say that difficult cases makes allyship more modest instead of having certitude and certainty about what to do. But that said, subsequent to the episode, they have been raising the questions of the imposition of extraordinary laws in the Northeast in general, not just Assam. They regularly release statements against, notification of disturbed areas, which then allows for a whole range of extraordinary laws to become operational. They have talked about detention, violence by extrajudicial violence by the paramilitary or law enforcement agencies, or detention. So they have spoken about a whole range of things in the Northeast subsequently. But on the migration question, they have found it quite tough.
Professor, I think this idea of allyship becoming more modest is something, it's something quite interesting to me, and it's something I was thinking about as I was reading the book, and specifically in chapter 2, where I started wondering about the position of the allies themselves, or the social position of the allies. So in the book, you complicate this idea that civil liberties are simply a non-party formation. So the activists that you study, they're wary of having this kind of party badge attached to them because it reduces their credibility. But over time, what we see is that many people who are involved in allyship, say civil rights activists, for example, they might move in to become, say, judges, or they may become, say, specific types of lawyers, and they're kind of moving inside the state. So their social position kind of changes, right? Now, is that the success of ally activism, or say you're influencing allyship from within the state, or does it kind of signal its dissolution in that the loss of this outsider position makes allyship less credible? And does this even matter as to which institution they're entering, or would you say it's necessary?
Let me begin by talking about this non-party bit, and then I'll come to what you said towards the end, the relationship between state institutions, the whole inside-outside bit. So non-party political formations was a term of phrase coined by Rajni Kothari, D.L. Sheth, and Harsh Sethi in 1984. They thought that there was a crisis in the party system in the country, in that parties were not able to be a good vehicle between citizens and the government. And they thought that because of that failure, a bunch of organizations have emerged in the country, which they called collectively non-party political formations. And these organizations are actually there to fill in the gap that the failure of party system has created. So when I interviewed activists, I had gone in with this idea that this will be autonomous from party politics. So the non in the non-party gave me the sense that this is autonomous from party politics, but I actually found that it was a situation of what I eventually argue is a contextual negotiation with parties. There's a lot of involvement with parties. For example, during the emergency, there is a opposition parties to the Congress come together with, there's a broader social movement and civil society opposition. So their parties as well as social groups have come together. Many of these civil liberties groups also allowed a certain percentage of party members to be in their organization, so long as it doesn't cross a certain percentage. Then some civil liberties members had been in political parties. I found that some had moved back and forth from political parties. Some had been part of various left parties, which is not the same as the parliamentary election fighting, liberal sort of imagination of a political party. And occasionally they have also worked with parties in the opposition to lobby for the causes that they are amplifying. So it told me that more than non-party political formations, more than non-party, they actually are third party. They are engaging with party politics contextually, strategically, and they are negotiating as and when their politics demands it. So all of this, that there will not be certain percentage. Party members can be part of civil liberties groups, but party line cannot be the line of civil liberties groups. So their focus was on organizational autonomy, much more than party politics, or whether or not we will allow any transgression between these two domains. The emphasis was, how do we actually maintain our autonomy? How do we maintain organizational autonomy? And different groups found different ways of doing it. Some tried to keep party members away. Some tried to keep party issues away. But that was what their focus was. So that's as far as their position is concerned, the position bit of the question. Now, in my experience, on the second bit of your question, I can't think of many who joined the state from the outset. In fact, I know the reverse quite a bit. Many retired judges, for example, they will become member of People's Tribunal or be part of a fact-finding group. So the movement is actually from inside to out, if at all, I would say. So there are lawyers and there are judges, retired ex-judges or people who have stopped practicing, who would then come and work with civil liberties groups. And that really helped because, lawyers will have a good sense of evidentiary practices. So they'll have an idea of, when you go for a fact finding, what must you collect? What kinds of evidence can you collect to make what can resemble a preliminary charge sheet, right? Like it can become, so you also know what kinds of evidence will be admissible in a court of law. So that, in that sense, the credibility of the practice became, I think, benefited, from the presence of both retired judges as well as lawyers. So that, but again, I would say that their position and the networks that they had helped in the politics of amplification. It helps take a case from Sessions Court to High Court to Supreme Court if you know people who are like-minded. So it in the process of amplification, this actually facilitated it.
Professor, I think in relation to these actors, at least what really forms the base of your book and what was one of, I think I really enjoyed reading it because of how you, essentially how you interpret the interviews that you conducted, and they really form the base of your book, and it starts from the introduction until the very end. So you use Kim Rogers' vocabulary of artifact of the self in order to say that remembering is never just, say, one linear account, but as, say, someone is giving an interview, they're continuously constructing the event that occurred, and this has an impact on the actors themselves. And across your 70 interviews, I wanted to ask, was there a dominant, say, emotional vocabulary in how activists recalled a particular period, for instance, pride, nostalgia, disappointment, etc.? And were there moments where the emotional truth of an account mattered more to you than its factual accuracy?
I really enjoyed. Your question has taken me back to my fieldwork time, and I really enjoyed the fieldwork bit of it, that going and talking to people. And I was trying to find as many first generation, like people who were active in the 70s, 80s. I was trying most hard to find them, which means that they were they had retired, they were in the 80s and 90s. So imagine I'm asking you to try and think back to what you had done some 30, 35 years ago. In terms of the dominant register, but I also want to say, interviewing, and for anyone who wants to interview, it's more emotionally taxing than you might think. Like I thought when I had first gone, I thought I will conduct 5 interviews a day, and then I realized that no, it doesn't work like that. This is not just going and switching on a tape and just recording something and coming back. It actually takes quite a bit from you to do that. That tone, the dominant tone, was mostly reflective. There's, of course, I've written in the book the whole self-effacement of allies. They are very uncomfortable with being the protagonist of any story. So there was a bit of that. Why don't you join us? Why are you studying us? Why don't you? Isn't your time better used to help with the organization or cause? Or people who would be uncomfortable with the term activist. No, I'm not an activist. I did what I had to do. But real activists are people who are on the ground. So there's always this: who is the real activist and who is not playing a dynamic there. So there was a lot of modesty present that I encountered. There was a lot of reflective. One or two were at the stage in their life that they were anyway thinking about writing some kind of a memoir, or so it really helped. I became some kind of a first draft exercise for them. There was also disappointments. We didn't do this right. This movement is, because, as People's Union for Civil Liberties and People's Union for Democratic Rights are not very well recognized names. You will not see them in the newspaper frequently. If at all, they'll be referred to as a generic name, in the civil liberties groups or civil society groups. So some of them were also disappointed by the fact that they couldn't become as influential they couldn't do as much as was needed to be done. So there was some disappointment. There was a sense of so much remains unresolved even today. The things have become even more difficult today than they were. So there was all of that. Interestingly, one aspect of interviewing older people is that they evaluate you. So then you go to somebody and they're like, what do you know about our group? What have you read about our group? Do you know this name? Have you spoken to that person? So there are more than 5-6 interviews that have started with, what do you know about the emergency? So then I had to say something to something that would convince them that my interest is genuine. So there is definitely that evaluation being done. Now all of this is actually useful ethnographic material for you. All of these are things that you can actually analyze and talk about in the work that one does. And you are absolutely right that people will not remember like a historical tape, which is true for all of us, right? We don't remember things. We remember things that made some groove in our head. So we remember impactful things, or we remember achievements, we remember terrible failures, we remember something that resonates with us or remains memorable for some reason. And then when we replay it, it may not give the researcher a sense of a chronological development quite in the same way as if you could replay some kind of a historical tape. That is not what it is. So that's what the artifact of the sort of self really means. But if I mean, the little that I have read on oral history, the value is not in the recall. The value is not trying to, play back some kind of a tape. There is an independent value of that memory and how people remember things and what they consider significant. So, of course, both things are important. Of course, you corroborate. You don't just take what people tell you as fact. You go back and you check with 3-4 other documents in terms of events and dates, and so there is some corroboration as a researcher that you will do. But the memory itself and the way it has been told to you is in itself fairly important. Sorry about that. If you could hear.
It's fine.
Go on. Yeah. So that's as far as the dominant register and the factual accuracy bit is.
And I think, I mean, this is something that stood out to me because I think when we first entered law school and we started with our sociology and political science and our history courses, we kind of had to let go of this assumption of always poking for the truth or thinking that things always move in a linear, trajectory. So it's like you have to find value or you have to learn how to read these ruptures as well. And like you said, this would have probably been your most useful ethnographic material in terms of, basically just reading the emotions of your interviewees as well. And on this note of fact finding, again, this was an interesting vocabulary that you'd used in your book. You describe fact finding as a form of left legalism, so revolutionary politics that you pursue through the language of, say, liberal constitutional law. Could you elaborate on that argument and on whether it can still do the work it once did, now that the institutions that it seeks to persuade, like the courts, the press, etc., increasingly appear suspicious of such work? And when our institutions, such as the judiciary, appear compromised, do you think there are limits to the vocabulary of constitutionalism? So this question is kind of struck me when I was reading the NIA bench remarks as an example. So that's where this is coming from.
Fact finding and left legalism. I use left legalism to refer to what seems like an interesting paradox, and that is that you have people very often, at least in that period, even more so, of left socialist, revolutionary sort of sensibilities, or taking up causes that are broadly in the progressive and left domain, but adopting a method of or adopting a practice that is very much in the liberal legal domain. So those of us who have, early sort of political theory training will think of liberalism and Marxism as two opposed philosophies and two opposed sort of worldviews, and therefore it was a very interesting paradox for me that there is left politics and there is liberal legalism coming together in this practice of fact finding. Over time, I have also come to notice that, you see, what is interesting in the fact finding is the legal form itself creating some legitimacy. When you do something, as I was just saying, when you do something that is done with the kind of rigor that could be admissible in a court of law, something that could become evidence in a PIL, that carries then a certain degree of credibility because of its rigor. So now, even if those fact-finding reports never reach the court, even if they just get published in a newspaper or they just get distributed in university networks and civil society domain or just get published, even when they don't actually go into the court, that form, the legal form, carries a lot of legitimacy and carries a lot of importance even outside of the courtroom. So, and that I found again very interesting, that social movements use law not in the sense of them going to the court to change law, but using the form, using the legal form itself to make something credible, and that I found very, very interesting. Can it still do the work it once did? See, I will say that there are different ways in which you will have to think about what is the work we want it to do, we wish it to do. If the government is favorable, broadly, if the government is broadly favorable, and if the allies are people who are successful in seeming credible, then of course it can bring accountability. So in some cases, it has happened that a fact-finding report has ultimately led to an independent commission, independent judicial commission being set up looking into the cases of violence. In other cases, there has been some degree of accountability sought from local administration or police functionaries, etc. When the times are unfavorable, fact-finding has still continued. And I used to, like in the first instance, I was a little surprised. I was thinking, if the government is unfavorable and if the government is going to delegitimize the fact finding itself, this has been done by money funding from foreign sources, or here are these people that are actually trying to bring shame to the country, or they're not good citizens, or they're anti-nationals, or they're anti-development, so on and so forth. I thought that when the government is unfavorable, fact finding will lose its purpose. But actually, that is not the case. Fact finding continues even today, whether it is to record, whether it is to archive, whether it is to fight a sense of we don't want to be erased, or we don't want our stories to be erased. So I think that fact finding continues to do the work it did, but that work changes based on whether the circumstances are favorable or not. But the practice continues. So if it is favorable, it is seeking accountability. If it is not favorable, it is seeking record and archive. And there is a very long, one of the things I regret is that it's not a personal regret, but I'm saying that we have lost out on, because these organizations don't have any one, office, or these are sort of people have joined in and left. So there exists a whole people generated archive of, extrajudicial violence in the country. It's just dissipated amongst many activists and many different organizations. But there is quite a people generated archive in the country. It's fragmented, but it exists and it's very valuable.
No, Professor, thank you again for that response. So, as we speak about what activism, ally activism looks like in the present age, I think another dominant theme, another way that you wrote this book, had this whole idea that you compared the movements in Delhi and Kolkata. And one thing we notice is you also mention how the how these movements were shaped by different factors. So in case of Delhi, emergency played a huge role, while in case of Kolkata, we see a strong hold of other, like, radical politics and the Naxalite movement. So I again understand that a lot of social causes and movements have a lot of triggers behind them, because it can't it just can't be one reason alone, as I understand it. So would you say that in the contemporary India, would you say, particular uh, are there any particular movements or instances in the current socio-political climate which might be shaping the social movements we have today and in the future nearby to come? So where do you believe that the present and future social movements are drawing their energy from?
Hmm. It's a very good question. It's a question I should honestly be thinking about more, because I focused on a particular historical period. So I will share my observations, but they are mere observations. I have not actually conducted any systematic study to say what I will say about the contemporary period. Uh, you see, the Delhi Kolkata distinction was important, not to I'm not saying that all of the people in Delhi think in one way and all of the people in Kolkata think in another, but I realized that a very big part of many activists I met in Kolkata referenced the counterinsurgency operations against the Naxalite movement as their formative exposure to violence or conflict that involves paramilitary forces and witnessing it in an urban center. And many in Delhi talked about the disappointment at the imposition of the emergency. We never thought Nehru's daughter could do this. So this idea that there is a profound sense of disappointment at the imposition of the emergency, and some faith that they had in the state had had shook in that moment. Today the landscape is quite plural. Now people are not, those are not, it's not like those are the experiences through which this energy comes. The landscape is, I can think of environmental activism as one sort of domain from where the activism on civil liberties happens. I have written a little bit about, and I'm beginning to be very interested in digital liberties activism. There has been, litigation against internet shutdown in the country, litigation against the unequal sort of digital governance norms, litigation against censorship or content moderation online. And I say this because the People's Union for Civil Liberties, which is one of the sort of oldest national civil liberties groups, was actually involved in the Shreya Singhal case when that, as well as when the court judgment was not being implemented, it was being routinely flouted. The PUCL went back to the court for implementation of its own judgment. So there is actually a link between the conventional sort of civil liberties activism and the climate, digital, contemporary activism around gig work, etc., which are also raising essentially similar kinds of things. And I could tentatively say that with digital governance, I think there is a little less of trying to raise the civil liberties issue after the harm has occurred, and instead look at the pipeline itself, look at governance sort of itself, and that has also started happening. But the language in which people do it, the social background of people that come, and the initial experiences that politicize them are quite different. But I'm very glad you asked this, because it has made me think about trying to think further beyond the 1980s, what happens to allyship in the country. So thank you for that.
Speaking on that front again about what allyship looks in the present age, and you mentioned the ideas of digital governments and how even the different forms and ways in which activism is operating today, like you mentioned, digital activism and so on and so forth. Another thing which was very like another question that I found myself thinking personally, because I tried to relate the events in the book a lot with what climate we live in today. So, your book emphasized on the fact that allyship, at least in the very initial phases, mobilize credibility more than numbers. So, we see a lot of social movements emanate and start, and in fact, mainly operate through social media platforms today, through other digital dissemination methods. So we see that a lot of we see a lot of emphasis on virality and visibility and like audience size. So would you say that this involvement of social media, has it made the whole idea of politics of amplification, which we just discussed earlier, does it make it better in terms of, does it make it more effective, does it democratize it by giving larger access, or can it be said to undermine the credibility based model and how things operated in organizations such as PUCL? Would you say that it's harming that sort of credibility built over the years, or has it in fact enhanced the activism environment in the country?
Thank you again. And again, a question that all of the questions that are about the present have been very, very useful for me. And I really was impressed with this credibility and virality, distinction. And I was thinking that I should actually think about this in a more systematic way. How does credibility and virality differ from one another? So thank you for that. Let me begin by clarifying the credibility bit a little more. So when we think of social movements, we usually think of numbers on the street, right? Or we think of a Twitter storm, or we think of there is a mass mobilization element to social movements um, very, very often. Now, when it comes to civil liberties activism, the mobilization is not numbers, the mobilization is of credibility, which is to say that maybe only 4 of us are saying something, but we are respectable, important people whose voices must be taken seriously by those in the establishment. So, and of course, it's a relationship. I should be credible in the eyes of the government. If the government doesn't think I'm credible, then I lose that power that I have. But a particular generation of people who came from a certain social background, like I mentioned in the book, doctors, lawyers, academics, journalists, etc., they are seen as respectable, people. They are their own personal reputation is significant. It's difficult. I'm trying to say it's difficult to dismiss them as some sort of irrelevant opinion. So when they lend their names to a certain cause, it means it brings a certain degree of importance to it. Now, the with social media and with amplification, what has happened is that many small groups don't actually need uh, a civil liberties group merely to take their cause from a remote location to national capital. That they can do themselves. So the bit of allyship, which was, for the lack of a better word, like a PR, that has actually gone. I don't know why this rings repeatedly. So, so to get reported and to get noticed, I don't think allies are required anymore. People can do that themselves using social media. But credibility in the age of virality actually has become even more important. When something goes viral, we are still asking, is this verified? Is this credible? Is this actually, can it be fact checked? So in that sense, virality can do some other functions, but it doesn't necessarily bring credibility to an issue. And that is still, I think, remains slow work. Doing investigation, talking to people, collecting information, etc., is still something that is very important. So even in the times of virality, I would say generating credibility remains a task and remains challenging.
So on that, like on the whole idea of who actually constitutes this ally, what their background is, doctors, lawyers, as you just said, uh, would you say that again in context of, for example, the anti-CAA protest, would you say that we are seeing these movements draw people from certain specific social locations and speaking a different political language? Because the whole idea of ally activism is based on this idea of not acting beyond your own self-interest, beyond your own material interests. So like a phrase that you used in your book was how middle class is the self-appointed custodian of the ideals of constitutional rights, etc., in the country. So would you say that we are seeing a shift in who and what background this ally comes from? Is the middle class, so referred to in your book, is the concerned citizen the same as who he was back in the 1890s? Or do we see allies speaking from a particular political language instead?
Hmm. Um, Concerned citizen, I thought, was a very useful category, or very useful sense of self-identification, particularly useful for allies because it's a way of saying that I have a stake because I'm concerned. I'm a concerned citizen. I have a stake in this issue, which otherwise doesn't directly affect me. I'm not imprisoned, but prisoners' welfare is important to me because I'm concerned. So concerned, the idea of concerned both as I am alarmed as a citizen, and also that I have a civic responsibility, and therefore I am concerned. So I think that concerned citizenship was a very useful form of citizenship, form of self-identification. It's a form of citizenship that also allowed uh, a contestation between governments and people on what is the ideal citizen behavior. It's like the government has one set of requirements in terms of what is good citizen behavior, and civil liberties activists have their own sort of understanding of that. Concerned citizenship very much exists still. It still exists. It's often the most popular language of expressing solidarity. You will still find many letters that are signed by concerned citizens. So it's very much there. But as I was saying previously also, I think the social world that produced concerned citizens has changed. And maybe also the language in which they speak has changed. So maybe, and I say this tentatively, the people that I met would emphasize more on a sense of duty, some kind of a constitutional, responsibility. Conscience is a category that would come up. Ethics would come up, and left commitments, progressive commitments would cut up. The desire would come up. The desire to practice one's politics. And from what I observe now, I think there is a greater language of intersectionality, solidarity, social justice that I see around now. So I feel like where they are coming from, as well as the language that they are using, has definitely changed over time.
So building on this theme of allyship in contemporary India, there was also one more thing that interested us, which is now we constantly see labels such as anti-national, extremist, and so on, that once came from perhaps say the governments and the police when it was necessary or when they felt like it, but now appear to be seeping into constitutional institutions as well. So the Lucknow NIA bench's comments, and recently also the Chief Justice spoke about young activists attacking institutions as well. So are we watching the state essentially, including the bench now, redefine what legitimate allyship looks like?
So I'm going to refrain from any political commentary, contemporary political commentary. I want to keep the conversation anchored in the book. But the question you raised is important. You see, when civil liberties activists come up with a fact-finding report that is deeply embarrassing for the government is not going to disagree with that report. The government will delegitimize the people who are conducting it. And that has been, and it's not just the government of India, that is governments worldwide. All over, governments will delegitimize the source of information that challenges the official version. And the more exposure, the more embarrassing the report for the government, the greater the desire to delegitimize. And I mentioned this before, this is a very old trope. So raising questions about the motivation of the activists, calling them, people who are not patriotic, or we've spoken about anti-national or extremist sympathizing, so on and so forth. Raising doubts over funding, who is funding them. All of that has actually, we've seen it throughout the history of post-colonial India. There is an example in the book from the activist who was opposing the Damodar Valley Corporation. So right from the 1950s and 60s, you have this going on. But the very fact that it has been happening for a very long time tells you that there is an ongoing contestation. This is not a settled debate. there is an ongoing contestation between the governments, subsequent governments, and citizens over the question of what is the meaning of a good citizen. What does good citizenship mean? The government will define duties in one way, and people will define what they think is their duty as citizen in quite another way. So, who can legitimately speak for the country in a civic role is something that is actually an ongoing battle throughout post-colonial India, and that remains. And I think it also comes with the territory of this activism.
I think, again, where this question stemmed from was, of course, now it's essentially the involvement of the judiciary as well, right? And the very contested question of whether the judiciary is part of the state and what role that might play in allyship. So to conclude, we have two final questions. And the first one of these, it takes me back to what you said, I think at the beginning when Hiranya had asked a question, which was about how when you interview someone, when you interview an ally, they're very reluctant to be the protagonist of the story, whatever their reasons for the same may be. So we have a specific question on this self-effacement concept that you use to analyze your interviewees, which is, did this tendency towards self-effacement create particular methodological challenges for you as a researcher, or how did you essentially go about it, and how did you identify and realize this very concept? And on a more broader note, how do you write the history of people who are uncomfortable with narrating their own significance? So how careful do you have to be, essentially?
So I will say that the self-effacement, as I told you, is in itself was analytically useful to me. More than seeing it as an obstacle, it became a thing that I analyzed. That why is it that all of these people have this shared moral code of, how is it that they have come to acquire this shared moral code? So that was. But yes, of course, when people are reluctant to talk about their own role, you have to, in conversation, go to the history itself and the practices that happened, and then weave into the conversation their role. They will, as much as they would like to, they will tell you. I think it helps if you can convey to them that your intent is sincere, and that and it also helped that I was not writing a history of the people. So it also helped me that since you've read the book now, I was analyzing a form of the politics and not. I was analyzing a form of politics. I was not actually looking at people's history, and there are those books. People have written their own memoirs. There are many. There are several books on the. There are several books on the. Sorry, just a second. Yeah. There are several books that look at the histories of these activists themselves and their own their life history, their biography. Many of them have written their own biographies. So my focus was on the practice. My focus was on the activism itself and little less of the activists. So it helped. That it kind of aligned well. But you're absolutely right that if you are ever in a situation where you are interviewing people that are reluctant to be the protagonist of the story, it does mean that you have to employ other means. So I tried asking friends about each other, and that helped. So one of the things I did is, instead of asking them if they were comfortable, I would ask, apart from you, who else was there and what were they doing? So sometimes people are happier to talk about each other than themselves. Sometimes you can ask children about their parents. And though in some cases the activists would never bring that side to the family, so the children remember them just as regular parents doing arithmetic and homework with them, but sometimes they do remember the activism. So one kind of gets around it one is if one is focused and sincere about wanting uh, to know certain aspects. But as I said before, because the book is not about life stories of individual people, it helped. It was not the biggest portion of my focus.
That brings us to our last question, Professor, which I think is, I mean, it's quite fitting for um, when it in this context. Um, so, after spending years researching people who chose to intervene in struggles that did not directly affect them, do you consider yourself an ally in the sense developed by the book? And has researching ally activism changed how you think about the responsibilities of scholars towards struggles in which they're not directly implicated? And again, this is interesting to me because of what you'd said earlier about the interviewees themselves interrogating you, right? Or they were trying to look at your, say, your sincerity on whether you were genuine and what your motivations were. So, how would you put this in terms of socio-legal scholars as a whole?
Yeah, I uh, I will. Unfortunately, I have a very short answer. I hesitate, I think, to describe myself as an ally of the activism just because I wrote a book on them. I think it would not be a. I also think that it's not a status that one can claim for oneself. It's a relationship. So the it's a relationship between uh, your who the cause that you want to spotlight and you, so the people and you. But I would say that given that allies are unseen in social movement literature, in that sense, the book can be thought of as an exercise in amplification. I am putting a spotlight on a overlooked actor within the social movement domain, and to that extent, yes, maybe to that extent, I am doing some kind of a amplification uh, for activists who are part of civil liberties groups. Um, in terms of my own sort of responsibility as a scholar, I do think that scholars should not just be reporting, and there isn't a way to report without actually taking positions. So I will say that it's true. I do believe that allies are doing very important work, and I also think that a democracy cannot survive if each of us is only thinking about our narrow self-interest. We cannot build coalitions and solidarities with those whose shoes we have not been in. That would be a terrible shame. So I do think that allyship is very important. I do think that allyship is quite needed in today's times, and democracy is better for having allies in the civil society domain.
Professor, that I think that is a very apt and befitting manner to conclude this conversation because we hear you speak about again the role of allies, and for a moment one could have wondered, okay, is this the whole idea of self effacement which is coming across, or is it? So I think that was a question that just popped in my head while you were speaking. So I think that concludes the questions that we had. And we would really like to thank you very much on behalf of our journal, Socio-Legal Review, and on our behalf for this very interesting and insightful interview because I think there were a lot of questions and assumptions that got challenged while you were answering these questions, like the whole idea about what non-party formations are, or how we were not very sure whether the movement is inside or outside when we talk about lawyers, judges moving in or out. And I think that was something which definitely challenged our assumptions right now. And I personally, by learning about how your interactions with interviews went and how you went about it in terms of methodology, I think that was also very amusing to hear about. And I think this entire conversation put into context a lot of discussions which are happening in the book itself. So I would definitely say, and I'm sure Arya would agree, that there was a lot that we learned about the book and the current climate that we live in the course of this conversation.
Thank you
On
so much. Thank you so much. I have really enjoyed thinking about the questions that you asked. I'm really grateful that both of you have read the book and read the book so closely. Yeah, I really owe both of you a big appreciation for taking the time to do this. Thank you so much.